Well, I see that it's 12 noon and we'll formally begin our program. Welcome, everyone. I'm Molly Klein, and I'm Vice Chair of the Weidenbaum Center Elliott Society Committee. And I have been a member of the Weidenbaum Center on the economy, government, and public policy for 10 years now. Those of you who know me know I'm a continuous learner and I'm a scientist. And so I really want to sit up and pay attention to the topics that the Weidenbaum Center covers. The programs never disappoint, and I know today we're in for a very excellent program. I'd like to welcome you all, and I thank you for spending your time with us today. And this is the fourth Women's Networking and Public Policy event, albeit we are doing it via Zoom for 2 years in a row now. But we look forward to more and hope that those will be in person. I'd also like to send a greeting from our chair, Jim Sheely, who wasn't able to be with us today. And he hopes you enjoy this program. I'd also like to acknowledge Steve Knight, who's with his mother, Janet. And Steve is also a vice chair of the Weidenbaum Center Elliott Society Committee. So thanks, Steve. And as we get into the program, I would like to introduce you also, everyone, to Professor Steve Fazari. And Steve has been so much fun for me learning from him during the 10 years that I've been a member. And Steve is, for the past 2 years, been the center director. In addition, he's an economist, of course, and he's a professor of economics as well as a professor of sociology, having been with Washington University over 35 years. And I love the little fact that Steve has been chair of both the economics department and sociology. But for sociology, that was the inaugural chair for the new sociology department. Steve is sought after as a speaker and is very well published. So without further ado, Steve.
Thank you, Molly, for that really sweet introduction. And yes, helping to resurrect the sociology department at Washington University has been a real gem of my career. And with Margot Moinester with us today, one of our faculty members who's just joined us fairly recently, it's just wonderful to have that. And it's been great to be leading the Weidenbaum Center these last couple of years. I was associate director under Steve Smith for the 12 years before that. So it's been quite a run for me at the Weidenbaum Center as well. So I'm going to be extremely brief, in part because it's fairly obvious. One of the important criteria for participation today does not fit me, but I am happy to welcome everybody. It's great to see old friends, of course, on the participant list, but also some new names. So I hope you find this program engaging and will join us for a lot of interesting things to come the rest of this semester and then into the future in the next academic year. I want to specifically thank everybody who was involved in planning this interesting event. This has been something now going on for a few years. I'm glad we've been able to continue it during the pandemic. So Alana Bain and Mary Maher in particular, along with other people in advance, when I know I'm missing folks who've been quite involved. Great to have Elizabeth Larson as our a senior staff member in the Weidenbaum Center and also hosting or moderating our event. Molly's the host, Elizabeth is the moderator. And then lastly, Molly, so kind of mutual admiration society here. It's been wonderful to work with Molly and Jim Sheely and Steve Knight as the leaders of the Elliott Society Weidenbaum Center group that's really been terrific, helping to bring everything together for us over these years. And in particular, Molly is kind of the, I guess not the grandmother here, Molly, it'd be the mother of the women's networking lunch over the years in terms of having the idea and the vision to move forward. And so we greatly appreciate that and are glad to continue this. So I've already talked more than I thought. Let me pass the program over to Elizabeth Larson to introduce our speakers for today, and I will happily fade into the background.
Thank you, Steve. And that was well done in keeping it to 2 minutes. So we are thrilled today to have two wonderful presenters who are talking about timely and fascinating topics. The Weidenbaum Center, as Steve just mentioned, is honored to support this event. We're so grateful for Dr. Molly Klein and her passion, her organization, her support of the center and our work, and just women all over St. Louis and really all over the country, actually, as we have a few people not from St. Louis joining us today. So today we are honored to have Professor Margit Tavits and Margot Moinester joining us. Margit is going to speak first, and we will take a few questions after each speaker has concluded. So please drop those in the chat if you have any, and we will get to as many as we can. And then at the end, when Margot is finished, time allowing, we will try to take any other questions that come in, but we'll end promptly at 1 p.m. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I will have to read this bio. So Professor Margit Tavits is the William Taussig Professor in Arts and Sciences, and she is chair of the nationally ranked Political Science Department at WashU. She specializes in comparative politics, and her research interests are relatively broad. She has studied various issues related to political parties, political institutions, corruption, post-communist politics, and gender equality. While she continues to be interested in these topics, her ongoing research extends the list even further and considers the effects of wartime violence on post-war politics, inter-ethnic cooperation, and women's representation. Some of her most exciting new research ventures into uncharted territory in political science by exploring how the language we speak affects how we think about politically relevant issues, such as gender and LGBT equality, environmental policy, and ethnic divisions. Professor Tavits has received several Weidenbaum Center grants to further pursue her varied research activities. And in addition to everything I just said, she also is a member of the Weidenbaum Center Executive Committee, and we rely on her heavily. So she is going to discuss today the effects of parental leave for fathers on gender equal attitudes. Margit, we're thrilled to have you, and we are so excited, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to this group and share my research. As Elizabeth said, I have greatly benefited from research support from the Weidenbaum Center. So most of my research has been sponsored actually by grants from the center. So I've been very lucky with regard to that. As Elizabeth said, my research agenda is relatively broad, but today, so one of the questions that I've always been interested in and continue to be interested in is how to improve gender equality, how to reduce gender bias. And so the research that I'm presenting to you today falls under that research agenda of mine. And as Elizabeth said, we're specifically here in this project that I'm going to present to you interested in how to reduce attitudinal gender bias. And the project that I'm presenting to you is actually a co-authored work with colleagues from Rice University and the University of Oxford. So let me share some slides. These will help me guide the talk. I didn't put any very technical details into the slides. So hopefully this will be easy for you to follow. Okay. Can someone indicate whether you can see this?
Yes, we're all good.
Okay, great. Okay. So as the title suggests, we are interested in here understanding how father's leave affects and whether and how it affects gender equal attitudes. So let me jump right in and start with sort of like a broader motivation, which is that when we normally think about parental leave, this is the traditional image that we have, right? Traditionally, we associate parental leave with women, mothers staying at home with the baby, with the child. And that's also how governments treat parental leave. So you can't read this graph. It's not necessarily to be able to read all of these countries, but it's basically a list of countries, all advanced democracies in the world. And the blue bar indicates the number of weeks that they provide paid parental leave for mothers. So important information out of this is that basically all of these advanced democracies, with an exception of one, provide paid parental leave for mothers. And this leave is relatively generous. It varies from country to country, but even the least generous leave is several months long. Now, this is what we traditionally see and what still dominates policymaking. But increasingly, over the past decade or so, governments are also introducing reforms where they extend parental leave to fathers. Now, it's still relatively less frequent. So it's similar graph, all of those advanced democracies listed here. And you see, there's still on the top several countries that provide generous paid leave for fathers as well. But then there's a bunch of countries in the bottom that don't provide anything, and several in the middle that provide sort of some nominal leave. No, but the important point is that there is this increasing movement to also introduce paid leave for fathers. And that's usually those reforms are motivated by equity. The idea is to promote more equal opportunities for women at home and in the workplace. So to produce more equal division of childcare and household work, and allow women to return to their careers sooner, improve their income, and those sort of like socioeconomic labor market related considerations. Now, we want to understand whether this paid leave for fathers could also have downstream consequences that would promote even broader social change by changing people's attitudes towards men. And the idea behind it is that what parental leave for fathers does, going back to the first set of slides that I showed you, is that it does break down the traditional gender roles. So traditionally, parental leave is associated with mothers. Now we're putting fathers in that caregiving role. We're breaking down these traditional gender roles and associated stereotypes that often feed these unequal attitudes about what men and women are like, what they're supposed to do, and what they are capable of doing. So by breaking those stereotypes, breaking those traditional roles, do we see downstream consequences on more equal attitudes? Oh my gosh. So yes, so this is our question. Does fathers' leave reduce attitudinal gender bias? And why do we care about attitudes? Well, we care about attitudes because they have been shown to significantly affect how women are treated. All right, so here is a partial list of what the research has shown with regard to unequal attitudes, the effects of unequal attitudes. They affect women's educational achievement, career advancement, sexual harassment against women, violence against women, women's underrepresentation, I should say, sexism and violence against female politicians, and the list goes on. So we care about attitudes because attitudes matter, and by changing attitudes to be more gender blind and more equal, we are also changing how women are treated and what their experiences are in a daily life. So how do we go about studying whether fathers' leave affects gender-related attitudes? So we traveled to Estonia to do that. Estonia is a small country in Northern Europe, and why we go there is that it offers us a setting that is similar to what sometimes in political science is called as natural experiment. It's essentially a policy reform that extended paid leave for fathers from 10 days to 30 days, so threefold increase. And it only applied to children born on or after July 1, 2020. So it was a very clear cutoff. And now if you think about the fact that pregnancy is one of those things that's not so easy to plan in terms of when the baby is born, then you can treat this cutoff as creating as if random assignment as to whether parents qualify or father qualifies for this leave or doesn't, right? Your baby happens to be born after July 1 or right before is sort of random. And if the baby is born right before, you don't qualify for the leave. And if the baby is born right after, you do. So we leverage that discontinuity. And then we fielded a survey and we recruited 700 parents whose baby was born right before the reform, so they didn't qualify for the father's leave, and 700 who did. And we interviewed them, the first group before the reform took effect, the other group after the reform took effect. Just a fun fact for you, so 1,400 parents amounted to about 10% of all babies born in Estonia in 2020 being represented in our sample. So that's how small the country is. But it also indicates that we are capturing a large share of the relevant population there, and targeting those parents wasn't always so easy. But because we have this relatively sort of quasi or as if experimental design, the analysis becomes easy, because what we do then is we compare the attitudes of parents who qualify for the longer leave to the attitudes of those parents who don't qualify for the leave, to identify whether father's leave plays any role in affecting people's attitudes towards women and men. So what do we find? We find that parents, both mothers and fathers, who qualified for the new father's leave express less gender bias. So putting fathers in non-traditional gender role does have the expected effect of producing or promoting more gender equal attitudes. And more specifically, we looked at 3 types of attitudes. And we found first that the gender bias is reduced in the socioeconomic domain, so attitudes relating to domestic affairs and women's and men's positions at workplace. So as an example of that attitude so those who qualified for the father's leave were less likely to agree that it's harmful to children if their mother works. So they're less likely to express these biased views about the correct role for women or the traditional role for women. We also saw that same effect in the political domain. So gender attitudes became more equal in the political domain as well as a result of the father's leave, with respondents more likely disagreeing that men make better political leaders than women do. So this is just one example of the types of attitudes that we were measuring in the political domain. A third set of attitudes that we looked at produced interesting contrast between mothers and fathers. So we saw that mothers, but not fathers, also express more support for positive action policies. So these are policies that are designed to correct for pre-existing bias. So essentially asking respondents to express pro-female bias. An example of that is asking whether a respondent agrees that recruiting women candidates is important, even if it requires excluding some men. So making sort of it explicit that any gains that women are making will be coming at the expense of men. So there we see an interesting contrast, and I can talk about that more if you have questions. Overall then, what we do conclude from our study is that paid father's leave does promote gender equal attitudes in social, economic, and political domains. It also promotes support for positive action policies, but only among women but not among men. And so why we think this is happening, again, is that father's leave breaks traditional gender roles, puts men in a traditionally women's role, and thereby also undermines associated stereotypes, which feed these gender unequal, gender biased attitudes. And the broader implication coming out of this study is that father's leave is just one example of a situation or a policy that promotes non-traditional gender roles. There may be other ways to promote men and women in these non-traditional roles that may have equally sort of positive effects in terms of reducing attitudinal gender bias. So that is just simply something that additional work, additional research needs to be looking at other potential ways or other potential policy interventions that disrupt traditional gender roles, whether they have equally powerful effects on attitudes, as we have shown here in the case of father's leave. That is all I had prepared, so I'm happy to take questions. Should I stop the share, Elizabeth?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
We had a few questions come to me, and then I will definitely get to Cynthia's. One was, there were a few notes about how the US is an outlier in with just maternity leave. And so do you think, this is a two-part question, do you think that countries that are already more progressive with maternity leave for mothers may already have more gender equal attitudes? And then the second is, from what you've presented, what are your lessons for from your research for the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely the case. In fact, studies have shown that there is a strong correlation between having generous parental leave and having more gender equal attitudes. So what our research design tries to get away from that. And so that's why sort of like this sort of quasi-random assignment, you cannot choose whether you qualify for this reform. Otherwise, fathers who are already progressive would take the leave and fathers who are not progressive will not take the leave. And then it's hard to separate out which causes what, whether leave causes attitudes or vice versa. And here we get rid of that. So you cannot choose, you either qualify or you don't qualify based on when your baby is born. So we're able to show that while, yes, this probably is sort of feedback effect, attitudes affect policy, policy affects attitude, but we are able to all show that policy does affect attitudes as well, meaning that even in already equal, relatively, so Estonia is a country where attitudes are already sort of like European average, right? Not quite the same as Scandinavia, which is the most equal, gender equal region of the world, but it's not also very unequal in terms of attitudes either. But even in that context, we can push those even further by introducing policies where that are conducive to further equalization.
Well, you just answered my next question about elaborating on the natural experiment and what that means, and you answered. So I think you are just brilliant, Margaret. Okay, so let's go to the chat. Are you advocating in your research or your writing to use the language of father's leaves or the more neutral term of parental leave?
I mean, parental leave is sort of like the more general term that includes both mother's leave and father's leave. And so it's sort of like, I as a scholar it depends on what I study. Here, I specifically studied the leave for fathers, so it made sense to focus on father's leave. When we talk about parental leave more generally, including both types, then that's the right terminology to use. Governments differ in terms of how they handle parental leave, right? How, in some instances, it's defined as parental leave, and then some portion of the parental leave is up to the parents to decide who takes it, whether fathers or mothers. Other governments regulate it much more strictly and say this many months for mothers only, fathers can't take it, and then a separate leave for fathers. So I think the terminology depends on what specifically is being talked about.
let's see, what, there was a question from Janet about the law in Estonia is not yet 2 years old. So what can be said about the likely persistence of the attitudinal shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, this would definitely require, it will be interesting to follow up on, first of all, sort of look at the behavior, who's taking this leave, and then, yes, to do follow-up studies and see to what extent this attitude persists and to what extent is it confined to that moment in time where we looked at it in 2020.
And then kind of going back to what I asked before about what are some of the lessons for research in the US, that chart you showed how maybe regressive is too strong a word, but maybe not, about maternity leave in the US. And so do you think we're more likely to see the US deal first with paid maternity leave and then maybe in a few decades deal with paternity leave? Or do you think that there is a push to deal with both right now?
Traditionally, it has been the case that maternity leave has come first and paternity leave has come second. In the US, because there really isn't national leave, it's very localized how these leaves have developed, and in different places they have developed differently, and in many places they have actually developed in a very equal manner, in the sense that they do exist, let's say, at a workplace where there is parental leave in the kind of the way I described before. It's parental leave for primary caregiver. And it's up to parents to decide which one of the two, mother or father, is the primary, and that primary takes the leave. And maybe there, in some instances, workplaces also offer something for the secondary caregiver. So it's hard to predict how and whether, honestly, anything is going to happen at the national level in the US. But traditionally, yes, it has been the case that mother's leave has come first, followed by father's leave. And even in countries where father's leave exists, mothers still get more. The only exception to that, as far as I know today, is Finland, that just, I think it was last year, 2021, implemented a completely equal leave for fathers and mothers. Fathers and mothers can take exact same amount.
And then as we're kind of just winding up, did you find that the effect on attitudes tied to actually taking advantage of the leave itself, or was it awareness of men who might not be fathers, of being aware of this leave?
So we only studied fathers, right? We didn't just study general population, just men. We looked at fathers. There was very high level of awareness among fathers about this leave. There was also high level of intent to take the leave. I think most people in our survey were intending, if they qualified, were intending to take it. But the effect that we identify is based off of whether you qualified or didn't. It's not based off of whether you took it or not, because it's going back to this. If we look at whether you took it and what the effects are, then we're back into this world where it's hard to identify whether you already had the progressive attitudes that made you take the leave, right? So yeah, our study only looks at the, are you aware of it? Do you know, can you qualify? Can you take advantage of the leave in theory?
Well, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And for questions that we didn't get to, we will try to get to at the end. So feel free to keep dropping them in the chat. Margaret will be here for another half an hour. Let me do that. Okay. So I now have the honor of introducing Professor Margot Moinester. She is an assistant professor of sociology here at WashU. She investigates questions concerning immigration, inequality, and health. Her current project uses quantitative and qualitative methods to investigate how and why rates of immigration enforcement vary over time and between demographic groups and across the elaborate jurisdictional landscape of the US. So articles from this project have been published in American Behavioral Scientist and Demography and received awards from the American Sociological Association and the Population Association of America. Her research has been supported by the American Bar Foundation and the National Science Foundation, among others. She has a PhD in sociology from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Brandeis. She has also received several Weidenbaum Center grants to further pursue her varied research activities. And today, Margot will discuss changes in immigration enforcement, policies and levels between the Trump and Biden administrations. So welcome, Margot. We are thrilled to have you. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to get to connect with all of you. And so I'm looking forward to telling you a bit more about my research. For today, I actually expanded it out, so I'm going to be telling you about shifts in immigration policymaking over the last decade. So it includes some of what was happening under Obama, and then show you how I use some of my research to show how those shifts map on to trends in enforcement, both across time and then variation across places. So without further ado, I will share my screen, and I look forward to your questions. So in terms of how immigration policymaking is happening in the United States, there has been we have not had major immigration reform in Congress for 35 years. The last big immigration bill that passed in Congress was in 1986. So in the absence of major immigration reform, there's sort of two ways in which immigration policymaking is happening in the United States at present. And one is through these presidential executive orders, and the other are through these memoranda that the sort of executive branch sends out that shape how kind of they want frontline immigration enforcement officers to kind of carry out their enforcement duties. So I'm going to walk through those. So the executive orders are things that get covered a lot in mainstream news. So things like the passage of the signing of law, the DACA, so the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival that Obama signed, and then later when he did DAPA, which was for the parents of US citizen children. And this was policy that tried to shielded from deportation, but didn't offer a path to citizenship for these individuals. Trump's travel ban, also known as the Muslim ban, is another example of executive orders. And on day one of entering office, President Biden signed a series of immigration executive orders to try to roll back what was done under the Trump administration. And these various executive actions are subject to a lot of judicial review and have had varied success. These judicial challenges have had varied success. So in the case of DACA, we saw that it was upheld by the Supreme Court, but the Obama administration's second policy pertaining to the parents of US citizen children who were undocumented, the undocumented parents of US citizen children, that was unsuccessful. And so anyway, the point here is that there is a lot of variation in that these executive orders are often challenged in the courts to varying levels of success, but many of them have ended up being have been blocked at the court level. So that leaves this other avenue for sort of shaping immigration policymaking on the ground in the United States. And that pertains to these memoranda that are issued often by the Department of Homeland Security, and then sometimes within that by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is a subunit of the Department of Homeland Security. And the key thing that these memos get at is they shape prosecutorial discretion of frontline immigration officers. And since the second term of the Obama administration, presidents have been using these prosecutorial discretion memos as a key tool for curbing or expanding immigration enforcement activity in the United States. And this, so what do I mean by prosecutorial discretion? What I mean by prosecutorial discretion is it's the authority of law enforcement agencies to decide where to focus its resources and whether or how to enforce or not to enforce the law against an individual. So we can think about prosecutorial discretion as being relevant to all law enforcement agencies and not just ones that are engaging in immigration enforcement. And a good example of that is to think about something like jaywalking. In a lot of jurisdictions, it is a ticketable offense to jaywalk, but it is also an offense that police rarely choose to enforce. And so this would be an example of police using their discretion to not fully enforce all parts of the law, right? And to give someone a ticket for jaywalking. And in the immigration context, there's been prosecutorial discretion since at least the Eisenhower administration, and different presidential administrations have issued these memos that say, like, this is how we recommend you kind of prioritize enforcement. But the Obama administration's memos were really unique in that they created this rule-like sort of system of exercising discretion. They made it how frontline officers exercise their discretion subject to centralized supervision. And they made it very transparent. So everybody, and they published nationally what their guidelines were. And so these are what the priority guidelines were. So there were three sets of priority guidelines. The first was pertaining to threats to national security, border security, and public safety. The second was pertaining to individuals who've been convicted of multiple misdemeanors or who are and individuals who are recent border crossers. So new arrivals to the United States. And then the third one is for everybody else. And basically the Obama administration said that unless you fall into priority 1 and 2, we are not going to pursue deportation. And so what does this look like on the ground? If in, say, 2013, 2014, after these memos went into effect, you were to sit in on immigration court proceedings, which I had done for a bunch of time in a lot of different places, it was very common practice to see a case come in front of an immigration judge, and for the prosecutor, so that's the ICE prosecutor, the government's attorney, say, we are administratively closing this case because it doesn't fit within the guidelines. And so what that meant for the individual who had been facing deportation proceedings is that their case was closed, but they weren't given any pathway to citizenship, any work authorization. It came with no benefits. It just was, we're not going to pursue deportation at this time, but the government could always reopen the case at any later point in time. And so that's what this looked like on the ground. And we had a lot of cases across the country getting closed, but it also meant that certain individuals were not getting apprehended in the first place because it was clear they didn't fit within these guidelines. And when Trump entered office, within week 1, the Trump administration got rid of all of the Obama administration's guidelines. And what this meant is that every immigrant in the United States who had in some way violated US immigration law was now considered a priority for deportation. So there was no differentiating an individual with, let's say, serious criminal convictions, which the Obama administration had sort of prioritized, and an individual who is undocumented, has no criminal record, and has been living in the United States for a decade plus with US citizen children, right? They were both considered equal priorities, basically, under the Trump administration policy for deportation. And so in my research, what I've been trying to do over the last several years is to piece together what immigration enforcement, what the scale of immigration enforcement looks like in the United States. And this is a particularly challenging endeavor because the federal government releases incredibly limited statistics and data on what their enforcement activity are, from like who they're apprehending and how many people in a given year to detaining and what's happening with these individuals' cases. And so this information is pretty hard to come by. And they also, when they do release this data, it's usually at the national level. And so it's hard to figure out how the enforcement dynamics might look different in Missouri as compared to Illinois, and things along those lines. So what I do in my research is I pull from these data sets that were obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and shared with me that capture tens of millions of records of people's moves in the immigration enforcement system over decades. And so some of the data are like every immigration court proceeding since the 80s. There's also data on every immigration detention and how people move through the detention system over a certain set of period of time. And so in my work, I try to piece together these various different data sources to get a handle on how growth of the US interior immigration enforcement system, and interior is a key word here, which I'll define in a moment, how that's changed over the past half century. And then I look at how contemporary enforcement practices within the US interior vary across US jurisdictions. And then I do a lot of work trying to understand what has been driving these changes both over time and differences across places. And so by interior enforcement, what I'm referring to are apprehensions and deportations of immigrants already settled in the United States for some length of time, which is usually enforcement overseen by the ICE administration, the ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement. And that's opposed to border enforcement, which are apprehensions and deportations of immigrants trying to enter the United States. And so it's murky because there's actually a lot of interior enforcement that happens very close to, let's say, the US-Mexico border, but because it is apprehending individuals who say live in El Paso and have been for a decade plus, that would be characterized as interior enforcement rather than border enforcement. And in my work, I focus on interior enforcement, both because it provides this lens for understanding how law enforcement agencies and legislators across different levels of government are engaging in the policing of immigration, and also because interior enforcement is tied to a unique set of consequences that I think are really consequential and that I try to study in my work. And so, what it means. So basically in this, it's like, what does it mean to be apprehended and deported after living in the United States for some length of time, building ties in the United States? Like, those are the types of enforcement actions that I'm interested in capturing in my work. So here is just a quick graph that shows how rates of interior removals, and we can think of removals basically as what we hear in the news about deportations. It's a more technical term. I'm happy to clarify in the Q&A, but this is basically how the practice of removing people apprehended in the interior of the United States has changed over between 2003 and 2019. And what I want to point out is that in the latter years of the Bush administration, we see this really steep increase, and interior removal rates peaked under the Obama administration in 2000, and I think it was like in 2010. And then it was in 2011 that we see the beginning of these prosecutorial discretions being passed. And there was a series of them that the Obama administration passed. And so over this course of passing these additional memos and sort of tweaking how they engaged with having frontline officers exercise their discretion, we do see a sharp drop over time in rates of interior removals, followed by a modest increase when Trump enters office in January of 2017. And so this is showing the first few years of the Trump administration. And I'm happy to talk about why that rate of increase is maybe lower than some would expect given Trump's immigration policies in Q&A if anyone is interested. And this is another way to think about how these policy kind of shifts might matter for enforcement trends, is to think about how much variation is there across states in the United States in their rates of enforcement. And so here I'm looking at rates of apprehension in the last 2 years of the Obama administration and the first year of the Trump administration. And to think about this plot is it's just showing how variable all 50 states were in their rates of apprehension in 2015 compared to 2016 and 17. So the lower you are on the y-axis, the more similar states are in their apprehension rates, and the higher up you are, the more dissimilar they are. And so what this is showing, that is, at least in these 3 years, we see that the practice of immigration apprehension becomes more divergent, and especially in Trump's first year in office, where we see this sharp increase. And so to sort of get at why that is, I just want to briefly kind of tell you about field work that I did in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so there's only so much that we can see when we look at these statistics from these administrative data sets from the federal government, and they don't tell us a lot about, it's pretty hard with them to try to tease out what's going on that would create these differences over time and across places and enforcement levels and rates. And so in my work, I also have done field work in a bunch of states that have very different enforcement dynamics to try to really understand what's going on the ground and how people are getting apprehended and why we might see differences across jurisdictions in rates of enforcement. And so here I'm going to tell you, show you some data from Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And these are interesting states to compare because they are overseen by the same ICE head. So there are ICE offices, field offices across the country that have different jurisdictional boundaries, and Massachusetts and New Hampshire are in the same ICE field office area. And so they are having the same directives from the top, but they have very different rates of enforcement, and who's getting picked up in these states vary. And so this is using the administrative data to show you what apprehension counts and rates look like in these two states over the 3 years of the last 2 years of Obama and the first year of Trump. And in terms of thinking about counts, what we can see is that the counts of the number of apprehensions in these states each year is substantially greater in Massachusetts than in New Hampshire. That's not particularly surprising because Massachusetts has far more non-citizens, so far more people who are vulnerable to deportation under US immigration law than New Hampshire does. So when we move from looking at counts to actually looking at a rate per 100,000 non-citizens, we see that across all 3 years, New Hampshire has substantially higher rates of apprehensions than Massachusetts does. And what we also see is that if we start comparing 2016 to 2017 in both states, there is a substantial jump in the number of apprehensions, but that the extent of the increase is far greater in New Hampshire. And part of what is driving that is the shift in who is getting picked up. And so basically what happened, and what I kind of come to realize in doing all this field work, both sitting in immigration court and interviewing attorneys and ICE officials and other folks in these different states, is that in New Hampshire, when the Trump administration's new policy came where they said everybody is a priority, what we see is local police and the state troopers start calling ICE every time they encounter a driver with driving without a driver's license. And so it's a small state, law enforcement know each other, the police know ICE, and they pull somebody over on the side of the road, they call ICE, ICE comes, they ID the person, see that they don't have a driver's license, let's say, and then they bring them into ICE custody. And this practice has been common in New Hampshire for a long time, but the Obama era prosecutorial discretion policies that said that an individual with no other criminal conviction is not a priority, it sort of tamped down on this kind of enforcement practice. And as soon as Trump came into office and dismantled the Obama era sort of restrictions, we see that this practice resumes at a very high level. And so by the end of 2017, nearly half of all arrests are of individuals whose their most serious criminal conviction is a traffic offense. And a traffic offense is not including a DUI because those are reported separately in the data. And so these are individuals largely getting pulled over and arrested for not driving with a license. And this increases, we see that this increases in Massachusetts, the share of individuals with these kinds of offenses increase in Trump's first year in Massachusetts, but to a far less extent. So less than 9% of all arrests in Massachusetts in 2017 were of somebody who this was their traffic offense. And I'm happy to get into this, but there's a lot of reasons why in Massachusetts this isn't the case, and it largely revolves around organizing at the state level to shut down the relationship between police and ICE. And so even if police are pulling individual drivers over without a driver's license, that stop is not getting converted into an ICE apprehension in the way that it is in New Hampshire. So I really want to quickly kind of go to what's happening. I know I'm almost out of time under the Biden administration. And as I mentioned, the Biden administration on day one rolled back a lot of Trump-era policies and has since implemented prosecutorial discretion memos that resemble the Obama administration's memos in a lot of ways, except that they do not include the same sort of review process of making sure that decisions by frontline officers are being subject to review by the kind of by the administration. And so there's a lot of concern that we will still continue to see a lot of variation across places, with some places enforcing the guidelines much more closely than others. But time will tell. What we do know is that arrests have fallen substantially in the interior since the Biden administration came to office. And so interior immigration arrests are now at the lowest level in 2021 as they have been in over a decade. And so what we also know is, as of this week, these prosecutorial discretion guidelines are being reviewed for in federal court. And so time will tell whether or not they are able to stay in effect. And lastly, I just want to very quickly conclude by sort of saying where my research is going, thanks to Weidenbaum Center support. And so with a colleague in the sociology department at WashU, Ariella Schachter, we have started a project that's looking at, we call it the National Study of Fear of Deportation. And we are surveying 6,000 first and second generation Latinx and Asian adults about their fear of deportation for themselves and others. And we look at Asians. Most of the work to date has focused on the effects of immigration enforcement policy and actions on Latinos, but Asian immigrants are actually the fastest growing undocumented population in the country. And so one of the innovations of this study is to do this comparative approach, because while there are a lot of Asian undocumented immigrants, they tend to not get swept up in the enforcement system at nearly the rate as Latinos do. And so in this project, we're really interested in understanding whether changes in the national and local enforcement climate, so things like the shifts in policies from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, whether or not those changes can change individuals' fears of deportation for themselves and for others, and then how changes in fear impact well-being and immigrant integration, and if so, for whom. So we've done the first survey wave, and we'll be going out in the field, thanks to additional funding, next month to resurvey the same individuals a year after. So we surveyed wave one right after Biden came to office, and now that there have been all of these changes under the Biden administration, we're going back in the field to resurvey the same individuals. So just to conclude, like, the key takeaways are that in the absence of congressional immigration reform, we see immigration policy making happening through executive orders and these PD memos. They're consequential for the trends that we see in enforcement, both nationally and across the extent to which there's variation across the US in rates of enforcement. But these policies are subject to a lot of judicial challenge and have been blocked at are increasingly getting blocked. And we still have a really limited understanding of how immigrants and their families perceive and experience these policy changes. And so that's what my next sort of set of work is trying to get at. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Margot. That was fascinating. One question that came in, and we are very short on time, so I just want to be aware. What do we know, if anything, about the effects of these divergent enforcement patterns in terms of outcomes such as non-citizen settlement patterns or contributions to local economic environments, or any other outcome that you can think of?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. So in terms of settlement patterns, the research that has been done has shown that so we have to think about like national policies, which is what I sort of focus on today, but that there's also all of this immigration policy making happening across states and localities. So one big example of that, for example, is Arizona's SB 1070, which further criminalized undocumented immigration and had a lot of other kind of dimensions to that policy. And to date, the research shows that implementing these restrictive immigration policies at the local and state level have not had an impact on where immigrants are settling. The main driver of where immigrants are settling is where there are jobs. And so that's what the research suggests. And then in terms of the impact, that the second part of the question was about how these policies matter for kind of individuals' outcomes, right? So we have a sense, we know that there's a lot of research looking at the impacts of like fear of deportation on Latino immigrants, and also like what it means to lose a family member to deportation, right? Like what is the kind of economic, family sort of set of consequences that can flow from this form of family separation. So we know those pieces, but what we don't really have a sense of is like how fear of the enforcement system varies across different groups, because we've largely been looking at Latinos and specifically undocumented Latinos. So the work that I'm doing with Ariella right now is trying to think much more expansively about the reach of the immigration enforcement system into the lives of a much bigger group of people than we usually think of. And so, for example, we found that even second generation immigrants, so those are individuals who were born in the US to immigrant parents, have high levels of fear of deportation for themselves, despite not being legally vulnerable to deportation. And so in doing the second wave, we're going to be looking at how this fear matters for key indicators of health, civic and political participation, and social integration and isolation. So I guess that is to say, have me back, and I would love to share more on that once we have the data collected.
Well, obviously the Weidenbaum Center is thrilled to help support that research, and it's timely and important. So as we close, I would love to thank Margaret and Margot for a fascinating conversation on two timely topics, and will be continuing to be needed to be discussed in our complex and evolving world. So I really appreciate you both taking the time out of your day to carve out this hour for us. As I've mentioned, the Weidenbaum Center is honored to support events like this. You're going to receive an email later today that has a video of this discussion, as well as a few of our upcoming events. I just wanted to highlight one. On March 8th at 4 p.m., we are having the former chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, who will speak about fiscal policy in an era of low interest rates. And it's sure to be fascinating, so please register. And you can always find us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And lastly, I really wanted to thank especially Molly Klein for the work that went into this event. She is a tireless champion of the Weidenbaum Center and of our work and of continued learning and of connection and networking. And she put hours and hours of work into this event to make this all happen. And she has energy that is inspiring and enthusiasm that's contagious. And we are so, so grateful to her. So thank you, Molly. I will turn it back over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. But I really want to thank the professors, Tavits and Moynister, and you also for your role in today, and especially a thanks to all who attended, because that's what makes this for all of us. And as you mentioned, the membership does allow for this kind of event, and also help support this very important cutting edge, and I'm going to say scientific research that we heard about immigration and about parental leave, father's leave, and gender attitudes. So thank you so much. And we again hope that we see all of you at these future and upcoming events. So I guess that's a wrap then for the 4th Women's Networking and Public Policy event, and hope that we could see you all in person next year. Thank you.